Redditor 1, this is my sister's story. Sandra didn't believe in any of that nonsense. UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts. It was all just stories people told to make their lives more interesting. 23 years working at the DMV had taught her that reality was mostly paperwork and long lines. Nothing extraordinary ever really happened. That's what she kept telling herself as she stood on her 7th floor balcony, unlit cigarette dangling forgotten between her fingers, watching something impossible move through her city's evening sky. The sun hadn't quite set, painting the buildings in shades of amber and rose. Below, cars crawled through rush hour traffic and pedestrians hurried home from work, their shadows stretching long across the sidewalks. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening in September. Until it wasn't. She first noticed it when the pigeons scattered from the neighboring building's roof. The object, she refused to call it a craft, drifted above Monroe Street, following the road's gentle curve with deliberate precision. It moved too low for a plane, too steady for a drone, and too wrong for anything she could rationalize. "Hey!" A young woman's voice cut through the urban ambiance from below. "Are you seeing this too?" Sandra leaned over her balcony railing. A couple stood on the sidewalk, their necks craned upward. The girl wore a green university hoodie, her boyfriend in a pizza delivery uniform. They'd stopped right beneath Sandra's balcony, completely transfixed. "How long has it been there?" Sandra called down, surprising herself with the tremor in her voice. "Like 5 minutes," the young man shouted back. "We've been following it since Jefferson Square. Nobody else seems to notice." He was right. The streets were still full of people, but they moved with the automated indifference of their daily routines. Heads down, ears plugged with headphones, eyes locked on phones. Only the three of them stood frozen, watching the thing that shouldn't exist. Sandra tried to focus on details to find something familiar she could grasp onto, but the object defied description. It seemed to shift slightly whenever she tried to focus on its edges, like trying to look directly at a floater in your eye. The only clear feature was a sort of ripple in the air around it, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. "We should follow it!" The girl below was already moving, tugging her boyfriend's arm. "Wait!" Sandra called after them, but they were already jogging down the street, keeping pace with the object's unhurried progress. She watched until it disappeared behind the Meridian building, taking her last shreds of certainty with it. The couple vanished around the corner, still in pursuit of whatever it was they'd all witnessed. Later that night, after 3 glasses of wine and hours of searching online, she found the forums. Dozens of posts from that same evening, all describing the same thing. Some called it a UFO. Others suggested experimental military craft or atmospheric phenomena. But what chilled Sandra most were the descriptions. How they all matched not just what she saw, but what she couldn't see. The way it seemed to slip away from direct observation. The rippling air. The strange selective visibility that made most people's eyes slide right past it. Sandra still doesn't believe in UFOs, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, she finds herself on that balcony, cigarette in hand, scanning the sky. And sometimes she thinks she catches a glimpse of that familiar ripple in the air, just at the edge of her vision. But when she tries to look directly at it, it's already gone. These days, she pays more attention to the people who stop and look up. Redditor 2. Some childhood memories fade like old photographs, but others stay sharp enough to cut. 20 years later, I can still perfectly recall the quality of moonlight on Sarah's face when she turned to me, her eyes wide with a fear I felt mirrored in my own chest. I was 9 that summer, and Sarah had come for our weekly sleepover. My bedroom was my favorite place in our house, mainly because of the window. It faced the Flatirons, those massive slabs of stone rising from the earth like ancient guardians. At night, you could see the occasional car making its way up the winding mountain road to Chautauqua Park, headlights cutting yellow arcs through the darkness. We were supposed to be sleeping, but instead lay side by side on my bed, watching those distant lights trace their familiar path. Mom had always said we talked too much during sleepovers, but that night we were quiet, mesmerized by the peaceful rhythm of cars climbing the mountain road. "Look, another one," Sarah whispered, pointing to a new set of headlights beginning their ascent. We watched, expecting the same gentle curve we'd seen a dozen times before. But halfway up, the light stopped. Not like a car pulling over. There wasn't anywhere to pull over on that stretch. They just stopped, hovering in the darkness. Then they began to rise, not gradually like a helicopter or plane taking off. The light shot upward in a sharp vertical line, beyond where any road could possibly go. They hung there, suspended above the mountain's peak, burning brighter than any car lights should. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The crickets went quiet. The wind died. Even the usual distant sounds of the city seemed muffled, as if something had pressed pause on the world. Then the lights moved. I've seen jets at air shows. I've watched footage of rockets launching into space. Nothing I've seen before or since has moved the way those lights did. They streaked across the sky faster than seemed possible, arcing over the mountain range before vanishing with a final flash of brilliance that left purple afterimages dancing in my vision. In the sudden darkness, I could hear Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow, beside me. The crickets slowly resumed their chorus, but the night felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. "Did you see that too?" I whispered, needing to know I hadn't imagined it. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. Without speaking, we scrambled off my bed and ran to my spare twin bed on the opposite wall, as far from the window as we could get. We pulled the covers over our heads and huddled together, every creak of the house making us jump. We didn't sleep. We barely spoke. We just waited, watching the strip of window visible beneath my blinds slowly lighten from black to purple, to the soft pink of dawn. The next morning, we didn't talk about it, not at breakfast, not during the day, not for years afterward. It was like we both understood that speaking about it would make it too real, would force us to confront something our young minds weren't ready to process. 20 years later, Sarah and I met for coffee when I was back in town. We hadn't seen each other since college graduation. After catching up on careers and relationships, there was a lull in the conversation. Sarah traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger and said, "Do you remember that night?" She didn't have to specify which night. I nodded. "I still can't explain it," she said. "I've tried. I've read about weather phenomena, military aircraft, everything I could find. Nothing fits." "I know," I replied. "I've tried too." We sat in silence for a moment, two rational adults confronting a memory that defied rationality. The funny thing is, as kids, we'd been scared, but not surprised. Children accept the impossible more easily than adults. It's only now, with our degrees and careers and logical minds, that the memory truly terrifies us. Sometimes, when I visit my parents, I find myself drawn to my old bedroom window. The view hasn't changed. The Flatiron still stands sentinel against the sky. The road still winds its way up to Chautauqua Park. Cars still make that journey at night, their headlights tracing the same familiar path. But now I watch them more carefully, waiting to see if they'll complete their journey, or if they'll stop halfway up, rising into the impossible dark. Redditor. 3. The first time I wasn't alone. That's important. There were 3 of us in my car that night, cruising down the highway with the windows cracked, letting in the summer air. Jenny rode shotgun, her best friend Maria in the back. All of us talking about nothing in particular when the light appeared. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Plane lights have a certain familiar quality, and I'd grown up watching enough meteor showers to know what those looked like. This was different, blindingly bright, and moving impossibly fast across the sky, but without any tail or trail, just pure concentrated light slicing through the darkness. We all saw it. That's important too. What the hell was that? Maria leaned forward between the seats, her voice tight with excitement or fear. Maybe both. Before anyone could answer, Jenny's phone buzzed. Missed call. Voicemail. Probably my mom, she said, reaching for the phone. It's pretty late. She put it on speaker, probably expecting her mother's familiar voice asking when she'd be home. Instead, what came through the phone's tiny speaker made my skin crawl. It wasn't a voice, not really. More like something trying to be a voice. Mechanical, distorted, incomprehensible. The sound filled the car with electronic stutters and warped tones that might have been words, if words could melt. Jenny yanked the phone back, her face pale in the dashboard lights. That's not normal. We were turning onto Maple Drive then, a street I'd driven 100 times before. But tonight, every streetlight was dead. Not flickering, not dimmed. Just absent, leaving us in a darkness broken only by my headlights. The familiar houses looked wrong in the shadows, like stage props arranged by someone who'd only heard them described. We tried to laugh it off. Coincidences, we said. Bad connection. Power outage. But we all drove home a little faster than usual that night. I didn't see anything strange again for almost a year. By then, Jenny and I had broken up, and that night had become just another story we used to tell, losing its edge with each retelling. Then came the second time. I was walking my dog, Max, around the neighborhood. It was one of those perfectly clear nights where the city lights seemed dimmer than usual, letting the stars shine through. I had my earbuds in, some playlist I'd made for night walks playing quietly enough to hear if Max's leash jingled. That's when I noticed the void. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a blank spot in the tapestry of stars overhead. But as I stared, the blank spot moved. Slowly, deliberately, it glided across the sky. Not just dark, but absolutely black, as if someone had cut a hole in the night itself. It was massive, roughly the size and shape of a football field, but floating silently at what must have been an impossible height. I pulled out my earbuds. Nothing. No engine noise, no wind displacement, just the ambient sounds of the sleeping suburb. Max hadn't noticed anything, too busy investigating someone's trash bins. The object, if you could call something so absent an object, drifted overhead with terrible patience. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared beyond the roof lines, taking with it any certainty I had about the world above us. Later, trying to explain either incident to friends, I'd catch myself hedging. Maybe it was a military test, I'd say, or could have been a weird cloud formation. The words felt hollow, even as I said them. The truth is, I don't know what I saw on either night, but I know what I didn't see. Anything that fits into my understanding of what should be possible. These days I still take Max for night walks, and I still find myself looking up at the stars. But now I'm looking for gaps between them, for places where the darkness is just a little too dark. And sometimes when my phone rings and goes to voicemail, I hesitate before playing the message. Remember that mechanical, almost voice, and wonder what it was trying to say. Because here's the thing about seeing something you can't explain. Once is strange, twice is a pattern. And patterns make you wonder what you might see a third time if you keep looking up. Redditor 4. Something in the woods. You never forget the moment when your ordinary world turns strange. For me, it happened mid-breath on an autumn morning when the familiar air suddenly turned arctic in my lungs. John had run ahead, as usual. We were both 15, childhood friends who'd grown up on the edges of farm country. The brush area behind our houses was our kingdom, a place we'd mapped and explored until we knew every tree, every dip in the ground, every seasonal creek bed. Or at least, we thought we did. David! John's voice cut through the trees, tight with something I'd never heard in it before. Come here and look at this. It's so weird. John wasn't one for dramatics. He was our voice of reason, the one who could explain away strange sounds and odd lights with scientific precision. That tremor in his voice sent me running through the underbrush, branches whipping past my face. I found him standing over what looked like a fresh impact crater, maybe 3 feet across. In its center sat a metallic sphere about the size of a softball, seeming to steam in the cool morning air. But something was off about that steam. It didn't rise like it should, didn't dissipate. It clung to the object like a living thing. John, ever the scientist, did what any 15-year-old boy would do. He found a stick to poke it with. As the tip of the branch approached the sphere, everything changed. Light erupted from the object, not just bright, but somehow solid, like liquid sunshine. It filled my vision, filled the world. I tried to run, to turn away, to close my eyes, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only stand there, fingers twitching uselessly at my sides, watching as the impossible unfolded. The sphere rose from its crater, smooth and silent. Above us, the canopy of branches began to sway and bend, though the wind that moved them made no sound. The temperature plummeted until each breath felt like swallowing ice. Then it appeared. The disk emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like it had always been there, waiting. 15 feet across at least, hovering silent and dark against the gray sky. The sphere shot upward, absorbed into the larger craft like a droplet of water returning to a pool. The light returned then, stronger than before. I felt it this time, not just in my eyes, but in my bones, in my blood. Gravity seemed to hiccup, the world's weight lifting from my shoulders for one eternal moment. And then I woke up. John and I never talked about what happened that morning. We'd pass each other in the school hallways, catch each other's eyes across the cafeteria, and something unspoken would pass between us. We still hung out, still did normal teenage things, but we never went back to that part of the woods. Sometimes now, years later, I'll wake up on autumn mornings and feel that peculiar cold in my lungs just for a moment. And I'll wonder, did we really wake up that day? Or did something else entirely happen in those woods? Something our minds couldn't process, couldn't accept? I don't have answers, but I do know this. John and I weren't the same after that morning. And somewhere in those familiar woods we'd known since childhood, there's a small crater that shouldn't exist, marking the spot where our ordinary world turned strange. Redditor 5. There's something different about the world at 6 in the morning, the space between night and day when everything feels slightly unreal. I've walked to work at that hour hundreds of times, watching the sky change colors while the city slowly wakes up. That spring morning in Manchester started like any other. The streets were quiet except for the occasional delivery van, and the sky hung in that peculiar pre-dawn state. Not dark anymore, but not quite light either. The kind of sky where bright things catch your eye. I knew the route well enough to walk it in my sleep. Past the row of brick buildings with their symmetrical windows, through the open stretch where the old factory used to stand. The low-rise architecture and minimal trees made it perfect for sky gazing, something I'd done countless times on my morning commute. I'd seen plenty of satellites, usually steady points of light tracking across the sky at predictable speeds. That's what I thought I was seeing at first. Just another satellite catching the sun's light before it reached us on the ground. But this was different. It was triangular, distinctly so, and moving faster than anything I'd ever seen in the sky before. Much faster. The object shot from east to west, covering most of the visible sky in perhaps 2 seconds. It was brilliant, almost painfully bright, like catching the flash of a mirror in sunlight. But what happened next made me stop dead in my tracks. Just before it reached the horizon, while still blazing bright enough to see clearly, it turned. Not a gradual banking turn like an aircraft would make, not a curve or an arc. It made a perfect right angle, switching direction as if the laws of momentum simply didn't apply. One instant, it was heading west. The next, it was shooting due north, moving even faster than before. In less than a second, it vanished. I stood there for a long moment, my travel mug of coffee forgotten in my hand, staring at the empty morning sky. Around me, the city continued its slow awakening. traffic lights changing for non-existent cars, early buses beginning their routes, the first birds starting to sing. The rational part of my brain immediately began trying to explain it away. A meteor that had somehow changed direction. A military drone with capabilities I'd never heard of. A trick of the light. A reflection. A sleep-deprived hallucination. But none of those explanations could account for what I'd seen. The impossible angle of that turn, the sheer speed of it, the way it moved like nothing bound by gravity or inertia should be able to move. I've walked that same route hundreds of times since then, always looking up at that pre-dawn sky. I've seen more satellites, planes, helicopters, even the occasional meteor. They all move the way they're supposed to move, following the rules we understand. But sometimes, when the sky is that peculiar, not quite dark of early morning, I find myself watching for triangular shapes, for lights moving too fast, making turns too sharp, for proof that what I saw that spring morning wasn't just a trick of the light or a story I told myself. Because here's the thing about seeing something you can't explain. It doesn't just change what you believe about the world, it changes what you believe is possible. And once you've seen something impossible, you never look at the sky quite the same way again. Redditor 6. Before the aliens invaded, Roswell was just home. I was born there, spent my summers there, knew every dusty street and sun-baked storefront. Back then, the most exciting thing in town was the tasty freeze, and that was fine by us. My grandfather worked at the Roswell airfield when the 509th was stationed there. I used to love hearing his stories about the base, though none of them involved crashed spaceships or alien autopsies. My aunt even lived in the old base housing after the city took it over, those simple, military-built homes that seemed to absorb the New Mexico heat. Twice a year, regular as clockwork, we'd make the trip back to visit family. This was my Roswell, a place where the hardware store still had hitching posts for horse-drawn wagons, where the police knew everyone's kids by name. I remember when my 17-year-old cousin got caught with beer in his pickup. Instead of arresting him, the officers made him pour each can out onto Main Street one by one while half the town watched and tried not to laugh. Then I joined the Air Force in '85, and my visits became less frequent. When I returned in the mid-90s, I hardly recognized the place. The transformation was startling. Sheet metal, crashed UFOs protruded from building sides, their silver hulls large enough to have carried actual passengers, if they weren't welded to restaurant walls. The old saddle shop still had its horse on the roof, but now it was surrounded by green-skinned aliens. Even the streetlights had been replaced with designs featuring alien heads, their glowing eyes watching over Main Street like sentinels. The local Denny's served cosmic eggs and alien burgers. The Main Street Theater, where I'd watched Saturday matinees as a kid, had been converted into a UFO museum, complete with its own crashed saucer installation. Inside, the exhibits felt more like science fiction than science, full of blurry photographs and secondhand accounts that wouldn't have convinced a child. Crystal shops had sprouted up between the old businesses, selling everything from tarot cards to UFO refrigerator magnets. The air that once smelled of saddle leather and hardware store paint now carried the scent of incense and tourist dollars. My local friends and relatives mostly rolled their eyes at it all, but they couldn't argue with the results. During the annual UFO festival, the town's population would swell from 38,000 to nearly 80,000. New hotels rose from the desert soil, and even Walmart decided Roswell was worth its investment, setting up shop next to a brand new mall. I spent countless summers hunting around those lands, including near the famous 5 Mile Ranch, where the crash supposedly happened. Hours under that vast New Mexico sky, watching heat mirages dance across the desert. Never saw anything stranger than a coyote or a dust devil, though maybe the aliens just didn't think I was worth abducting. The intensity has died down some since then, but Roswell still has its parade, its festivals, its steady stream of true believers and curious tourists. The town found its niche, even if it had to import it from outer space. Sometimes I drive down Main Street and try to see it through my childhood eyes, the way it was before alien eyes watched from every lamppost, before silver saucers became architectural features. Part of me misses that sleepy town where everyone knew everyone, where the hardware store's hitching posts weren't decorated with little green men. But towns, like people, have to change to survive. Roswell just chose to change in the most unexpected way possible. And maybe that's fitting for a place that, depending on who you ask, either hosted the most significant extraterrestrial event in human history or pulled off the greatest tourist transformation since Dracula put Transylvania on the map. Either way, those aliens sure knew how to boost the local economy. Reddit. 7. Sometimes the strangest things happen when you're not looking for them. Like that night in May, when our college town went dark. The electric company had announced it weeks in advance. A 5-hour blackout starting at midnight to calibrate the system for the new power grid. Leave it to college students to turn a utility maintenance project into an excuse to party. By 11, half the campus was hosting blackout bashes, as if we needed a reason to stay up late in May. Our group ended up at Tyler's place, one of those off-campus houses with a pool that landlords always regret installing. There were maybe 15 of us scattered around the deck and lawn, nursing drinks and waiting for the lights to go out. At midnight exactly, the town went dark in sections, like a theater after a show. First the campus buildings, then the streetlights, finally the houses. Within minutes, the stars emerged in force. The night was perfect for stargazing. Clear, cool, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. We sprawled out on pool chairs and lawn blankets, pointing out constellations like we actually knew them. Sarah, an astronomy major, was showing off, identifying satellites and planets with casual confidence. "That bright one's Jupiter," she said, pointing. "And see that steady light moving? That's probably a satellite." "And that shooting star?" someone asked. "Just space debris burning up," Sarah replied. "Most meteors you see are tiny, like grains of sand hitting the atmosphere." We'd been at it for maybe an hour when I spotted it. An orange light crossing the sky. At first I thought it was another meteor, but something about its color caught my attention. Most meteors I'd seen were white or blue-white, sometimes with a greenish tinge. This was different. A steady, burning orange, like an ember floating in the dark. I kept watching, waiting for it to flare and fade like meteors do. That's when I noticed what was missing. The tail. Every meteor has that characteristic streak behind it, but this light was just moving. Clean. Precise. Then it stopped. Not gradually like something slowing down. It just stopped, hanging there in the black sky. Before my mind could process that impossibility, it changed direction. A smooth, deliberate turn that physics said shouldn't be possible, and began moving back the way it had come. For a moment, I said nothing. What do you say when you see something that can't exist? But then, "Did anyone else see that?" Tyler's voice cracked with excitement or fear. "The orange light?" Sarah sat up straight. That couldn't have been." "It turned around," Emma said quietly. "Meteors don't turn around." "Satellites don't either," Sarah added. "Nothing we have can move like that." 5 of us had seen it. 5 different people tracking the same impossible object across the stars. The others looked at us like we were crazy, but they'd been focused on their phones or their drinks or their conversations. They hadn't been watching. We stayed out there until dawn, long after the others had gone inside, partly hoping to see it again, partly trying to convince ourselves we'd seen it at all. We threw around explanations: experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, mass hallucination. None of them fit. The power came back on at 5 a.m. exactly, streetlights and house lights flickering to life like nothing had happened. Students stumbled home from their parties, the sky began to lighten, and that strange orange light became another college story, filed away with all the others. But sometimes, on clear nights, I find myself looking up. searching for that ember orange glow among the stars. And I wonder, what if it's still up there, watching? What if, all those times we thought we were studying the stars, something among them was studying us?
I still don't know what we saw that night, but I know this. In a universe vast enough to hold whatever that was, unexplained, might be the most honest explanation we have. Explanation we have. Explanation we have. Explanation we have.